Good morning, my friends. We are continuing with our roadmap to right living based on the 52 qualities that Swamiji speaks of in this book, Affirmations for Self-Healing. Let's start with a prayer. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, friend, beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, beloved Master Paramahansa Yogananda, saints of all religions, dear friend and guide Swami Kriyananda, humbly we bow to you all. Help us to understand your divine guidance as it comes through these wise words of Swamiji. Help us to know how to implement them in our lives, how to live according to these high ideals, that we may free ourselves from delusion and grow in the light. Om Peace. Amen. So, happiness is an attitude of mind born of the simple determination to be happy under all outward circumstances. Master has made comments like this in many other places, where he says, circumstances are always neutral. Whether we receive them as happy or sad depends upon the predisposition of our mind. You know, it's such a radical idea, because we are simply so accustomed to thinking that what goes on around us in this world is the cause of how we feel on the inside. We don't instinctively think first that we bring our consciousness to a situation and then everything else follows from that. I remember in my late teens when I really began to understand that everything was about consciousness, and that if I changed my consciousness, my entire experience of life was different. That was an era in which people were changing consciousness by drugs and by psychedelics, which I quickly realized had that effect, but it wasn't a real transformation. It was chemical, period. So you take a chemical and the chemical makes you different. It doesn't make you different. And it just wears off, and then there you are with whatever you have. But what the psychedelic era did, and even though Swami Kriyananda was profoundly opposed to drugs of all kinds like that, not of medicine, but of drugs to get experiences like that. But he did see that it did wake people up to the idea that reality emanates from the inside. And if you change the internal picture, then external reality is perceived differently. And even over time, external reality begins to conform itself to the inner reality that we are projecting. This comes out later in other of these qualities that Swami talks about, when he talks about how to focus your mind to influence and change events. So what I've found with a lot of ideas like this one, which are so big, happiness is an attitude of mind born of the simple determination to be happy under all outward circumstances. It's not like you can just say that, just sort of declare, oh yeah, I'm happy no matter what. But what it does is it does exactly what we've called this series. It provides the roadmap. When I met Swami Kriyananda and began to learn, which I had actually began to learn the principles of self-realization a few years earlier, but especially after I met him, because that's when it all became clear, is that finally there was a fixed point of reference. That's how I've always felt about the spiritual path. It's a fixed point of reference. So I can tell where I am in relationship to that which I really want. And what I really want is freedom and happiness. And when there's a fixed point of reference, like a statement that happiness does not depend on outward circumstances, it depends on the attitude of mind. So then I know what question to ask, not why are you doing this to me? Why is the world not conforming to what I want? Why do so many bad things happen to other people? Why do people suffer? All the questions that we ask that either relate to us personally or relate to the world around us. And all of those questions we think are the question to ask about what causes happiness and what causes suffering. The line in the sand that the teachings of self-realization provide, being a fixed point of reference, then I know I can measure myself in relationship to it. And I don't have to be perfect. I mean, that's the mistake people make. It also allows me to say, it looks like I'm really caught up in the belief that if this person doesn't love me, then I have to be lonely. Looks like I'm really caught up in the belief that because there's suffering in this world, I have to suffer too. Meaning, it's wrong for me to feel happy when people are starving on the other side of the planet. So I may still feel that way, but I can now think, okay, what can I do about my own attitude? Where does happiness really come from? Where does suffering really come from? So that's what we're trying to get here. We're trying to get very clear ideas. Happiness lies not in things, nor in outward attainments. It is the gold of our inner nature, buried beneath the mud of outward sense cravings. Okay, see, that the problem is that everything about the way we're made as human beings is outward reaching. I was with a couple who were friends when their first child was born. A little girl, who's now a beautiful grown woman now, and she had a little bit of distress in her lungs, just, literally in the first minute of her life. And it was in a hospital setting. And as a consequence, the nurse picked up the little baby girl and left the birthing room where the mother, the father, and I were, left the birthing room with the baby to take her to another area where they could pull the stuff out of her lungs or whatever they needed to do. The father and I followed the baby. And it turned out to be exceedingly minor, and within a minute, the baby was fine. She was sitting on some kind of a table, and her father was leaning over to her. This is like the literally first 5 minutes of life. And I watched the little girl reach up her hand to her father and grip his finger. As it happened, he was a very big man. She was a newborn, so the poignancy was extremely intense. And like many fathers, he fell in love with her in that moment, and she's ruled his heart ever since. But I thought, being a philosophical person as I observed it, I thought, oh my, look at that. Right from the start, there it is. She reaches up and tries and grabs a hold of something that's going to make her happy. And it did, and has. He's been a wonderful father. But still, we're just made that way, you see. Once we come into a human body, our senses point outward. And the confusion, the God-created confusion of this is that world seems exceedingly real, and the relationship of our happiness to the things that happen outside of us seems exceedingly real. And there we are. That's just where we are. But it says here, happiness lies not in things, nor in outward attainments. It was very poignant to me at a certain point when we were beginning to develop our elementary school here. I live in Palo Alto, and there's quite a few very, very, very well developed private schools in this area based on many different educational theories. Some of them are well established and have beautiful facilities. There's a lot going on. So when we were first starting, we went to visit a couple of the key teachers and I and some others. We went to visit some of these schools just to sort of see what was going on, to introduce ourselves. You know, we are a niche kind of school, and sometimes, well, most of the private schools in the area oversubscribed, so it was also practical. You know, the students that you turn away from your school, maybe you want to tell them about us because we might be very suitable for them. So we were in one school, and we were talking about the fundamental basis of how our educational system works, which is basically to raise children from the beginning according to this roadmap for right living. Because we are meditators, because we understand the goal of life is self-realization, how would you educate children? If that's your life premise, how do you educate children? Why not raise them up in this inwardly defined sense of self instead of just throwing them to the wolves of all of the materialistic, outward-looking ways that people follow? Why not teach them to be strong first in themselves, and then from that inner strength, see how they go forward? Our schools are now more than 40 years old. So the school here is 30 years old. So it's not like this hasn't been tested. You know, we have 2 generations, full generations of students who've come through and grown up and started their lives. So we can see whether this really works. And it's been very interesting. It's not like all the children, we're not a parochial school. And it's taken some time to really make that point really clear. We called ourselves Ananda schools here in Palo Alto at first. But as I explained it to Swamiji at the time, it's impossible for people not to think we're a parochial school then. They think we're trying to raise children to sort of follow our beliefs, so to speak. So we changed the name to Living Wisdom Schools, because Living Wisdom Schools are, for the most part, sponsored by Ananda, but they're not parochial. It's impersonal principles that you can then use for whatever spiritual path you follow, whatever path you follow in life. And some of our alums at different times, in different ones of our schools, because this is not the only example in the country, or now the world, but difference of our alums local and at Ananda Village, one of the girls stood up and said, you know, what I learned from my schooling here is that whatever if I'm willing to put out the energy, whatever I set my mind to do, I can accomplish. I mean, how could you do better than that? And one of our alumni who has a completely different life career and so on, she hasn't taken up any accoutrements of Ananda, but she's been very successful in a unique niche field that she's followed. And she tells the whole story about the obstacles that she had to overcome, how she had to make hard decisions based on ethical and moral considerations that other people thought were unimportant, but where there is dharma, there is victory, so she took the right choice. When all doors closed to her, she knew it wasn't possible for all doors to be closed. There was always a creative solution. She courageously just chose extremely creative solutions, and everything has worked out for her in a very impressive way, because she was raised in these principles, that my happiness does not depend on what happens outside me, but on my attitude of mind. And yes, of course, it's because in her ethical and moral choices, she had to give up the possibility of great outward success and money. She's since made a very good living for herself, but she had to choose her ethical values over easy money. And she made the choice that she knew would actually bring her happiness, not the mere acquisition of outward things, but the inner attitude that she was developing in herself. So that word outward sense cravings also has to be moderated a little bit, because sometimes people freak out and think that that means I have to be austere, I have to be celibate, I have to be parsimony, not whatever the word is, very restrained, and just all sorts of ways that I don't particularly want to be. And so it's not like you have to start out immediately to be a monk to be happy. It means that what makes us happy is not the kind of self-indulgence that other people think makes them happy. You know, that if I can be as promiscuous as I want, or take as many drugs, or drink as much as I want, or eat as much as I want, or whatever it might be, that all that experience is really going to make us happy. And Swami just simply contradicts it. He calls it the mud of self-cravings, of sense cravings, which, try it and find out, basically. When somebody asked Swami Kriyananda once, this was like in the early 70s when the word sexual revolution was a really popular phrase, and a lot of people who were involved with Ananda and with him at that point were coming out of the hippie movement, which was a real breaking down of conventional barriers and things like that. So somebody asked Swamiji, what do you think of the sexual revolution? Swami is a monk representing a very orthodox tradition. You would think that you could predict what his response would be. He said, I don't think it's a bad thing. He said, for this reason. He said, because people are trying to make their actual experience the criteria of their values, rather than just passively accepting the dogmas imposed upon by others. He said, I think it can be a helpful thing if people are honest about their experience. Which is to say, if you just go in determined to prove that a libertine lifestyle is a happy lifestyle, and then you just insist that it is, despite all evidence, then no, it's a terrible thing, and it'll just confuse and destroy your life. But if you're saying, I need to understand for myself, I'm not just going to take the moralistic rantings of the people around me, I'm going to make experience the criteria of my values, provided you're honest in your experience. And honest also means if there's a voice of authority that you have reason to respect, there's no principle involved in just becoming a contrarian. Just because everybody says it's true, I insist it's not true. Some dogmas are merely social conventions and should be rejected. Others are based on the truth of the ages and should be respected. So that's what he's trying to get across to us. And I was starting to go back when I was saying we were visiting these other private schools, and so we were talking about the basis of our school, and the essential basis is really very simple, which is no parent, all parents, all good parents, are concerned with the overall development of their child. They're not just trying to make them expert in one tiny field without regard for their emotional maturity, for their happiness, for their ability to get along with people, for their capacity for love, just all the values that, as life goes on, we realize that these are the values that really determine how our lives turn out. So many schools become just insanely focused on intellectual development measured by grades. When there was, in the early years of Ananda Village, we had a school that went up through 8th grade, but when it came time to go to high school, the children went to the local high school. And some children, even after we had our own high school, wanted to swim in a bigger pond, so they would go anyway. But there was this girl who'd gone through our lower school and then was now in a high school, and word came back that she was on the honor roll, and so I saw her, and I congratulated. I said, well done, I'm glad that you found it easy to excel. She started laughing. She said, you have no idea. She said, when I was going to school here at Ananda Village, she said, my teachers, and she named a few of her teachers, she said, it wasn't enough that I could answer the questions. I had to answer the questions with a good attitude. I had to be doing my work with enthusiasm. I had to be cooperative with the other students. I had to be respectful. Just all these different human qualities. She said, at that school, I just answer the right questions on the test, and they never asked me anything else. She said, it's a piece of cake compared to being here. And that is exactly right. And our school is like, we try to raise children in the context of school, because we're not their families, we're not their parents, but in the context of school, we feel that the purpose is to educate the whole person, to give them the tools for actual success in life, not merely success in school. And self-esteem and things like that are a very important part of it, but the right kind of it. So here we are in this school, and so we've been talking about this. So they showed us in the hallway, there was this visual display that was a tree, and then all these individual leaves had been posted on the tree. And it was this self-esteem tree. And it was an effort, a well-intentioned effort on the part of the school to work with other dimensions of the children's character. And every child had written on a leaf, or whatever this class was, they'd written on a leaf why they, what the basis of their self-esteem were. There were maybe 30 leaves on the tree, and I read them all. Every one of them, except for one, the self-esteem was based on an outer achievement. I got 100% on this. I'm captain of the team here. We won the championship here. Just every one of them was some accomplishment. This was a school. This was a very high-end school in this area that juries for IQ. These schools, they don't let you in unless you were in the top 2% of the country in your IQ. And then they're very proud of the fact that their children get admitted at elite schools. But, you started with that as your premise. But they were high-achieving families and high-achieving children. And they had self-esteem because they were high-achieving. One leaf said, I feel good about myself because I'm not as moody as I used to be. Which I thought, well, that was good. That meant there was some degree of self-mastery. And yes, of course, external achievement requires some self-mastery. But what happens when somebody is better at them and takes the captainship away? What happens when they get a job and the boss is unfair and fires them? What happens when they make a bad investment and lose their money? What happens when divorce comes? What happens if their child that they had all these hopes for, turns out to have some serious neurological issues? I mean, go on and on and on, you can see. If my happiness depends on my being able to manipulate the world and have it come my way, that's a very fragile basis. If my happiness and my self-worth depends on that, it's a very fragile basis. And we know it's a fragile basis, and therefore we're always insecure. I had a very complicated psychology growing up because I was very good at school. I came from an intellectual family. I knew how to read long before I went to school because everybody else in my family was reading all the time. So it was just something that it seemed like you should do. I have a propensity with words, not with numbers, but propensity with words can often serve you very well in school. And so I did well in school. It required nothing of me. So on one hand, I would be praised for doing so well, and also for the first 15 years of my life, I was in a town where the overall intellectual level was not that impressive. I subsequently moved to California to a college town, and it got a little bit better. But I was lauded for things that required no effort, that were, I would call them achievements from past lives, that I myself did not get happiness from because it didn't have any meaning to me. So I always felt incredibly insecure because I knew that I, underneath that, had not really accomplished anything. I'd just done this thing that people seemed to value. And it was very, very confusing to me until I got to self-realization, and then I had a point of reference. And then all my other talents or abilities, they weren't nothing, but they became anchored in something that had more, for me, more gravitas and more potential not to disappoint, you see. It's anyway. This is all past lives for me because I've been a yogi for many incarnations, I'm sure. So the values of this world were always a little confusing to me. But this is what's being written here. This is the roadmap for right living. So then Swami says, when you know that nothing outside you can affect you, no disappointment, no failure, no misunderstanding from others, then you will know that you have found true happiness. So once again, Swami lays before us a very high standard. When you know that nothing outside you can affect you, no disappointments, no failure, no misunderstanding from others, well, I can say when I know that I hope no circumstances outside my life will touch my happiness. But then again, should we see? Now this is the other error that I've observed myself and others do on the spiritual path. Because the mountain is really very, very high. Because what Swami's working with here, the roadmap that I'm trying to lay out for us, is the roadmap that leads to self-realization, that leads to absolute freedom. Yes, it's the Everest. It's the 15 times Everest height of personal development. It's the goal of all our incarnations to be realized in this way. It's quite dismaying. And it's very easy. Years ago in the Yoga Journal magazine, which at that time was the way we communicated, the yoga community talked to itself before the internet through this magazine. And at one point they put an article into the magazine that was called The Dark Side of Meditation. And I mean, I remember at the time we all laughed before anyone read it. The dark side of meditation. You know, like what could be the dark side? And this is what they wrote, which was actually, it turned out to be very, very astute. It said, many people are drawn to meditate because they're high energy, high achieving, what we used to call type A personalities. I don't know if that still exists, where you're very determined to be the best at what you do. And of course, those kinds of people can become quite high-strung and quite stressed. And so that kind of personality may seek meditation as a way to ease their stress. Well, that's a perfectly reasonable thing to do. Okay, now you're not just trying to be CEO of one company. You're trying to be one with God. So all of a sudden, the stakes have gotten so high. The stakes are infinite. The stakes are eternal. And it just like, and it's like no disappointment, no outward achievement. It just, all this has become absolute. So the dark side of meditation is now you have to strive for perfection. You just don't have to be as better than the rest of the pack. You have to strive for perfection. And they talk about how it can make a competitive type A people completely crazy. And instead of easing their stress, it makes it far worse. In truth, I have seen this happen. I have seen people come in, and when they realize what's being asked, they'll do one of two things. They'll just quit and run away. Or they'll start lowering the mountain so it's closer to where they're standing. And there are even spiritual teachers who bring the mountain all the way down to where you're standing, and then you just simply declare that what I'm doing is actually very, very spiritual. Don't do that, because in the end it won't work. It's as simple as that. You know, truth can't be legislated by our preferences. We have to become truly and totally free. God bless you, my friends.